Okay, here we are live for the final session in this year's African Literature Association lecture series. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to you from wherever you're logging in. Before we start today, I do want to draw attention to the fact that Professor Valentin Mudimbe passed away on April the 21st, and at this very hour, Professor Mudimbe is actually being laid to rest in North Carolina. So before we start proceedings today, I'd just like to start with 30 seconds of silence in honor of one of the giants of African literary studies. And I apologize, I was showing the wrong shared screen. I had hoped to show you basically the biography page of Professor Mudimbe. But we honor his passing. Like I said, he was one of the giants of African literary studies, and we mourn his passing. So to pick up though where that leaves off, welcome and thank you for being here. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Simon Lewis, and I'm sitting here in Charleston, South Carolina, on another beautiful spring morning. I currently have the honor of serving as the Vice President of the ALA, and I'm the person on the EC, the Executive Council, who is charged with coordinating these lectures. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to host these sessions for the last couple of years. And I do want to thank everybody who's been involved in them, either in front of the camera or behind the scenes. Particularly want to give a shout out to Lexi Langendorf for all the work she does in setting up the YouTube and the Zoom logistics, and also to Akin Adeshokan, whose brainchild these were in the days of the COVID pandemic. Just in case you haven't actually attended one of these virtual lectures before, let me take a minute or so to explain the logistics, how we're operating. Our guest lecturer today, Professor Carmela Garritano, is on Zoom with me and our moderator, Professor Odarti Wellington, along with Lexi Langendorf, our web whiz, while you are watching along with the YouTube site. Please, for a start, if you wouldn't mind, in the YouTube chat, go ahead and let us know where you're zooming in from. It's been very good in previous sessions to see that people have been tuning in from all over the world, which is one of the enormous benefits of this particular mode of interaction. Another benefit of this format is that you can comment and ask questions as they occur to you while the speaker is speaking, without interrupting her, because you can simply put your question or your comment in the YouTube chat, and Lexi and I will be monitoring that, and we can feed them into the Zoom chat for the discussion at the end of the session. And of course, also, even after the end of the session, you can continue to put questions relating to this particular lecture in the ALA Facebook page, so we can keep the discussion going even after the session, the YouTube session is over. So those are the technical arrangements. Let me now very briefly introduce today's moderator, Professor Dorothy Odarti Wellington. Dorothy is currently in her, I think, second year on the EC of the ALA, and among other duties, she serves as the caucus liaison. She's joining us today from Canada, where she's a professor in the School of Languages and Literatures at the University of Guelph, specializing in Afro-Hispanic literature, contemporary Spanish fiction, and fictional narratives of migration. She earned her BA from the University of Ghana in Legon and her MA and PhD from McGill University in Canada. She's the editor or co-editor of 3 books from 2018, Trans Afrohispanismos, Puentes Culturales Críticos entre África, Latinoamérica y España, from Brill and Rodopi in Leiden in Holland. The 2008 collection, Contemporary Spanish Fiction, Generation X, from University of Delaware Press, and a translation of Bahia Mahmoud Awaz, My Mother, My Teacher, a memoir from Western Sahara, which is, I believe, still forthcoming in the MLA Texts and Translation series. So welcome, Dorothy. Thank you for doing this. And I will now hand things over to you to introduce our guest speaker for today.
Thank you very much, Simon. Welcome, everybody. Bienvenue, bienvenidos, Akwaba to you all, and thank you for joining us. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Carmela Garritano, Associate Professor at Texas A&M University. And firstly, I would like to congratulate Dr. Garritano on the recent publication of a new book, African Energy Worlds in Film and Media, which, as many of you know, was released recently in March. Today, we are privileged to hear her speak about this exciting work, among other things, its theoretical framework, the films it features, and the insights it offers into contemporary filmmaking in Africa. This publication is the result of many years of sustained research, building on Dr. Garritano's previous scholarship, including her earlier articles such as Contesting Authenticities, African Film Critics, and the History of Early Video Production in Ghana, published back in 2008. African Energy Worlds in Film and Media is actually Dr. Garritano's second monograph in the field. Her first was titled African Video Movies and Global Desires, a Ghanaian History. This book was praised by reviewers as, quote, a response to calls to counter negative Western representations of Africa by highlighting the production and distribution of media content by and for Africans. Another reviewer underscored the fact that in this book, Dr. Garritano models a way of reading popular texts that pay attention to both the material conditions of their production and the ways that these conditions affect aesthetic form and content, a feature that you'll find also characterizes her current book. In addition to her monographs, Dr. Garritano is co-author of the book, A Companion to African Cinema. This is an anthology featuring a global community of scholars, and one reviewer describes this work as offering exceptional insights into African cinema. Dr. Garritano's journal articles, too numerous to list here, cover themes across both literature and film and have appeared in prestigious journals such as Research in African Literatures and Journal of Cinema and Media Studies. Her research has been deeply informed by extensive fieldwork, particularly in Ghana, where she has conducted studies since 1998. Notably, her research often goes beyond the usual urban centers and extends to lesser research regions of the country when it comes to film. Over the course of her career, Dr. Garritano has received several research grants, including the Glasgow Humanities Center Seed Grant and the Humanities Research Fellowship at Texas A&M. Despite her busy research schedule, Dr. Garritano maintains or remains committed to community engagement. She served for a number of years on the board of the Brazos Valley African American Museum, and just this last February was among a group of distinguished members honored for their service and continued support of that organization. She has also served on the juries of film awards such as the African Studies Association Film Prize and the Black Star International Film Festival Award in Accra, Ghana. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Carmela Garritano. Dr. Garritano, your audience.
Thank you. Thank you for that very lovely introduction. Thank you to all of you for being here. In Texas, it's early, so I'll say good morning, but good afternoon and good evening for those of you who are in locations where it is afternoon and evening. It's a real honor and privilege to be part of the ALA lecture series. I feel very, very fortunate to have been invited. I'll talk today broadly about energy humanities, say a little bit about the interventions I hope my book makes, and then maybe read about the book for you just to give you a sense of the span and scope. And then we'll open it up for discussion and questions. So I think now I'll share my screen. I'm having difficulty doing that. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So, energy humanities, we might think of very generally as an offshoot of environmental humanities or post-colonial eco-criticism. Um, it's still an emergent field that has grown and gained more attention, I'd say, in the last 2 decades. People who work in the energy humanities are obviously perhaps interested in approaching environmental challenges through the lens of energy. And linked to that, they display a deep concern with the uneven distribution of energy, of the atmosphere, as climate responsibility, as well as the impacts of global heating. Like those who work, of course, in the environmental humanities, folks who work in energy humanities are deeply concerned with the climate crisis and committed to thinking about decarbonization and how the humanities can help us in that incredibly complicated and difficult task. Um, I think what the energy humanities brings to the environmental humanities is an attention to energy justice. That might be perhaps its most important contribution. And the idea that all and any work that we do in the future on sustainability and creating decarbonized, more green energy futures has to account for energy justice, has to account for the fact that there are still many, many people who don't have access to energetic modernity. Um, and even though that is the case, are forced to absorb the majority of the impacts from global heating. Energy humanists bring humanities methods to bear on the study of energy, recognizing that Energy is not only a technological or perhaps even geological topic, but it's also social and cultural. And if we are to move away from carbon-based energy sources, we have to deal with energy. It's imperative, in fact, that we deal with energy at the social, cultural, and even, I would say, the subjective levels. So, specifically, my interest in energy humanities probably emerged when I discovered the petroculture group at the University of Alberta in Canada, and particularly the work of Ezra Seisman, who was one of the founders of that um, petroculture group. Also, Dominic Boyer, who is an anthropologist, Semeni Howe, who is an anthropologist. The two of them are at Rice University. It was their work that initially piqued my interest in this new field. And then, of course, the writing of Jennifer Wenzel. Some of you may know her research. Her most recent book applies the methods of echo criticism to reading African literature. And Wenzel importantly made the point that African cultural production of all kinds is still vastly understudied in both environmental humanities and this emergent field of energy humanities. So, most obviously, I hope my book intervenes by calling attention to African cinema and all that it has to offer if we're thinking about global warming and decarbonizing for the future. The second sort of general intervention that I hope the book makes is to bringing energy into the frame of what we might broadly call post-colonial eco-criticism, which to my mind has tended to turn to African cultural production as a way into understanding what Ian Bauckham describes as the exorbitantly vulnerable citizen of the Anthropocene. And so if you think about things like analyses of photographs of the Niger Delta, or perhaps even Kajitan Iheka's discussion of electronics waste in Accra. Um, Within that frame, we tend to think about Africans as victims who are threatened by things like sea rise, waste colonialism, extractive toxicity, as well as various forms of other slow violence. And important though those interventions important though that is, and of course absolutely necessary to think about how African cinema and literature and popular culture helps us raise awareness about those things. I want to ask the question, is vulnerability the only theme expressed in African arts of the Anthropocene? And I think at this point I'll just read a bit of the book or from the book in my general notes to you. The argument that I make is that African energy contexts are much more interesting, nuanced, and contradictory than uh, post colonial eco criticism has perhaps fully acknowledged. African cinema brings into visibility features of African subjects' multi layered and complex energy worldliness. Here I follow Edward Said's concept of worldliness to refer to the material as well as the political and economic conditions texts originate from and seek to intervene in. Energy worldliness more specifically describes the energy forms, systems, and infrastructures that are portrayed in and support the production and circulation of African cinema. But it also includes energy as intertwined with the relations of power challenged by the films and art that I examine in the book. African cinema across forms and genres asserts the call for energy justice made by post colonial citizens of the Anthropocene, a call that must be central to our attempts to imagine the immense transformations required to disentangle ourselves from fossil fuels. The films articulate African claims to what James Ferguson calls modern life, lives of security made possible by affordable and reliable access to energy. The films remind us that Africans as agents are part of energy-intensive projects and processes, and are also among those who advocate for the preservation of life on Earth and promote more sustainable ecological relations. The films signal a future focused on anti-colonial energy policies that prioritize shared and equivalent opportunity and risk. The method that I describe in the introduction to the book and that I obviously try to apply throughout, I call very, very generally an energy analytics. Um, Within that analytics, I attempt to basically do three things. Grab the hook of energy, which I'll say more about in just a moment. So, talking about energy in themes that extend a hook, right, that thematically address energy as an issue. But I also, to complement that, try to draw energy out of films that don't address it, directly address themes related to energy. But I also try to, in particular in one chapter, consider energy as crucial to what we tend to think about as context. And that would be the political and economic conditions that are represented in the film, as well as the production, distribution networks that inform the creation of the film. In her introduction to the volume Fueling Culture 101, Words for Energy and Environment, Jennifer Wenzel describes the value of, quote, protocols of reading and modes of inquiry that can perceive the pressure that energy exerts on cultures, even and especially when energy is not said, when energy is invisible, erased, elided, and so ubiquitous so as to elude representation and critical attention, end quote. Wenzel emphasizes the importance of locating energy in the absence of the hook of the thematic, texts and other cultural objects about energy, or where energy regimes become unmistakably manifest. To understand the strong connection between modern life and energy, she suggests that we recognize energy's pressure, especially when it seems to be absent. This book grabs the hook, as I said, and analyzes films that directly address the extraction of uranium and carbon-based resources, as well as films about pipelines, gas stations, petrol smuggling, and electricity. But I attempt to move beyond the thematic to incorporate energetic objects like light bulbs, batteries, power lines, and cell phones to narrate space. I analyze interactions between plot and setting, people and things to demonstrate that props function as more than inert features of a static background. They provoke and direct action and also actively generate the film's sensorium. Finally, African Energy Worlds uncovers the energopolitics behind the history indexed in the films to bring energy into visibility. It was Dominic Boyer at Rice University who invented the term energopolitics to denote the energo-material contributions of energy to political power and as a shorthand for the massive hidden influence that energy exerts over political and economic systems. Turning to energopolitics, this book demonstrates that cinema, African cinema in particular, offers a powerful reflection on energy's imbrication with capital accumulation and African underdevelopment. I also argue that sovereign debt, as experienced by citizens of many African countries, manifests the energopolitical regime that became dominant global after the 1970s oil crisis. African films that critique life lived under sovereign debt, I suggest, challenge this regime, even when they never mention energy. So part of the work then of the book, or the critical orientation might be a better way to say that, is to bring what we might think of as the background into the foreground, or the mise en scène into meaningful registers, to think about setting not as an inert, right? It's not a container into which we inject a story or meaning, but that that background mise en scène is meaningful and affectively laden. I want to just say a little bit more in particular in relation to that, bringing the background into the foreground, in relation to the films of Sissako and Haroun, because I think those films, and again, the ones that don't directly address energy, interest me in this book because they seem to beautifully and brilliantly exploit cinema's ability to represent the real, especially the material and sensory features of energy and its entanglements with human and non human life. Following the film critics who you may or may not know, Lucia Naguib and Tiago De Luca, I find that for Haroun and Sissako, both of whom conceptualize realism as the foundation of their aesthetics and politics, the world is not a mere construct or discourse, but made of people, animals, plants, and objects that physically exist, thrive, suffer, and die. And that's a quote from Lucia Naguib. They feel part of and responsible for this material world and want to change it for the better. I conceal realism after Naguib as a mode of production that leaves its imprint on the text. Real locations, non professional actors playing themselves, improvised dialogue and movement, and unscripted performances incorporate the material and sensory dimensions of the real into the diegetic world of their films, stressing duration, using long takes, and rendering affective relations in film form. Haroun and Sissako achieve cinematically and formally what might be called a hyperrealism that emphasizes materiality. This commitment to the material world is attuned to the speculative realism of ecological thinkers like Timothy Morton and many others. Morton suggests that the climate crisis and everything we know and feel about it necessitate new ways of thinking, interacting, and making art, and basically just being in the world. He asks us to open our minds to what he calls the ecological thought, the radical coexistence and radical intimacy that erases distinctions between nature, culture, human, animal, living, and non living things. And I would suggest again that also erases the distinction between background and foreground, mise en scène, and narrative. Radical coexistence, Morton writes, must challenge our sense of what is real and what is unreal, what counts as existence and what counts as non existence. It eliminates the binaries that place humans over and above other forms of matter and life. Morton very usefully uses the metaphor of mesh to understand the interconnectedness and interdependence of everything on our planet. In the book, The Ecological Thought, which he released in 2010, he explores various metaphors and examples to illustrate what he means by mesh. The ecological thought permits no distance, he explains. Thinking interdependence involves dissolving the barrier between over here and over there, and more fundamentally, the metaphysical illusion of rigid, narrow boundaries between inside and outside. So, again, that sort of links to this idea of ethical realism. Art that stresses the material might be regarded as ecological in that it disturbs our sense of what is static and what is vibrant, what is natural and what is artificial, and of human agents and the locations and objects on which they act. Attention to materiality of energy sources, I would add, like hydrocarbons and wind, and forms of energy like electricity in African cinema and art helps us understand agency as relational and distributed, disturbing the extractive colonial mindset that undergirds modernity. African cinema does more than stimulate our ability to imagine radical coexistence and ergo political futures. The films examined here demonstrate Catherine Yusuf's point that Black bodies bear a vastly disproportionate share of the burdens of the Anthropocene. In the uranium mines in Arli, Niger, in the enclaves of extraction in the Niger Delta, Africans absorb the toxic byproducts of energy intensive modernity. African films depict what Tom Davies in his research on Louisiana's Cancer Alley describes as toxic biographies to make slow violence noticeable, vital, and manifest. Going further, the focus, I think, on the uneven global distribution of machine power and embodied energy, industrialization, and muscularity extends Yosef's argument into 21st century regimes of labor and highlights the enduring anti-Black biopolitics, which, within the neoliberal energy capital nexus, overlay the histories of slavery and colonialism that Yusuf places at the heart of her book. The African films featured in this book, set in under-industrialized cities and villages with no electricity, draw viewers into the lives of the people who do the work of machines, men and women whose physical energy draws water from wells, washes laundry, transports fuel, plants and harvests crops, spins cotton into yarn, and bakes bread. African feature and documentary films expose energy poverty as energy underdevelopment, and they assert political claims to safe and secure lives made possible by electricity and fuel. So there's the cover of the book. It's a photograph that I took in northern Ghana that I'm kind of proud of and like. And I've provided you here on the other side of the screen with just a breakdown of the chapters, again, to give you a sense of the scope of it. Perhaps you'll be interested in teaching chapters from it or using parts of it in your own work. Let me just, in the minutes that I have left, just say a little bit about these chapters, and then I welcome your thoughts and questions. The book comprises, as you see, I guess actually 7 chapters. I say 6. And it's loosely organized to track the energy commodity chain. So beginning with sites of extraction and ending with plastic and electronic waste. The first chapter focuses on understanding the time frames of ecological violence, and that isn't a new approach. Several folks have done that. Um, um, I hope what my intervention is to compare work by African auteurs and African commercial filmmakers, Nollywood filmmakers, and think about how those two different registers of cinema manage the representational challenges created by what Rob Nixon describes as slow violence. I build on Nixon's literary analysis to explore how cinema, African cinema, reveals the various temporal aspects of violence caused by resource extraction, uranium in Niger and crude in the Niger Delta. In this case, film form works as a kind of interscalar vehicle by producing temporality at different scales. And I don't have time to say much about this, but you may recognize that metaphor of the interscalar vehicle from Gabrielle Height's work on uranium. Paying close attention to the time people spend waiting in Idrissou Morokapai's poetic documentary Arlie Deuxième Paris, released in 2005, means calling attention to the work as an artistic and activist endeavor that attempts to help us understand the prolonged and elongated impacts of uranium mining through cinematic form. Morakapai uses cinematic devices like duration and long takes to give time structure and uncover evidence of deep planetary history in human and non-human matter damaged by nuclear radiation. Produced and released in 2015, the Nollywood movies Black November and Blood and Oil use the cinematic and narrative conventions of action films to portray the intensity of the lived destruction that characterizes the extractive zones of the Delta region. These genre films, right? So these are films working at a very different register, struggle, I suggest, to represent the Delta as a site where the imperceptible slow violence of environmental degradation interacts with the high speed and visceral violence of armed conflict. So, in this chapter, I want to show how the Delta films provide an opportunity for us to question, or maybe even we'd say push back a little bit on Nixon's reservations about the capacity of genre films, films that, like these Nollywood films, participate in what he calls dominant structures of perception. Um, to rouse public sentiment. So Nixon would suggest that those sorts of films can't do that, but I want to say that these Nollywood films show us that in fact they can do that. They can rouse public sentiment on behalf of ecologies afflicted by energy-related violence at multiple temporalities. Chapter 2, called Oil Pipelines and Debt Relations, considers indebtedness sort of broadly in the films of Mahamat Saleh Haroun, who I talked about a little bit earlier, the Chadian director, and within the context of the Chad-Cameroon Petroleum Development and Pipeline Project. I argue that, or remind folks that since the 1970s, which plunged many African nations into economic collapse, oil has been fundamental to post colonial debt relations with international financial institutions. It's not surprising then that African films like Diop Mombeti's Hyenas and Abderrahmane Sissako's Bamako have agitated against energy resource extraction and sovereign indebtedness. In recent years, Haroun's films have deepened cinema's exploration of African indebtedness, exposing the interplay of sovereign debt and subjective debt, as experienced by those who live in Chad, where oil reserves have guaranteed the debt incurred to support the $3 billion pipeline project. Taking place during the same time as this immense extractive project, Haroun's films center on African men who struggle to manage personal debts and everyday precarity, conditions caused by, I point out, sovereign indebtedness of post-colonial countries in what Timothy Mitchell calls the post-war petroleum order. The chapter extends to expand the historical and political context of Haroun's films to include oil wells and pipelines, and it asks if these cinematic investigations of debt relations might help us imagine an ergo politics that advances energy and climate justice on a planetary scale. The images that you see here are actually taken from a documentary by a New York filmmaker called Dana Apt. And I put this documentary in conversation with the fiction films to think again through the ways in which the oil context that is latent in the fiction films is sort of brought into the spotlight in Apt's documentary, which is about the Chad Cameroonian pipeline project. It sort of follows the pipeline from Chad through Cameroon to the coast, demonstrating that all of the promises for development have reached a very limited sphere of people. And she's keen on, of course, focusing on those who haven't benefited from oil wealth. And you can see here in the first still a photo taken from the documentary. In the background there, you see the Esso, the Exxon oil extraction installation. And the point here is that it's interesting that because it's video, it's sort of flat, right? It's almost as if there's not a great, there's a bit of depth of field, but it's not too great. But I think that enables her to call attention to how close that oil installation is to this village. And here we're at a very impoverished village school where the headmaster talks about not seeing the benefits of oil and asking questions like, why can't oil companies build us better schools? The second photo is an image of a man who is showing the filmmakers the compensation booklet that Exxon provided to community members. And in this conversation, he's talking about how inappropriate the compensation that was provided was. It was things that they don't necessarily need or use where he lives. And he makes the point that if they want to compensate us, they should give us money because we will know best how to use that money. So partly in this chapter, I'm also trying to encourage people to teach this documentary or write about it or ask their libraries to purchase it because it's an important film that hasn't received a lot of critical attention. The third chapter of the book, whoops, I don't want to go there yet, sorry. The third chapter of the book is called Energy Infrastructures and Petro-Noir Sensibilities. It introduces that term, petro-noir, to describe prestige and art films from Africa that retool the narrative and formal conventions of film noir to denounce the endlessly deferred promises of oil-based national development and infrastructural modernity. Except the first film I discuss, and that's Fatkine. The films analyzed in the chapter Up at Night, Viva Riva, and Grigri detail incomplete, failed, or underdeveloped energy infrastructures across several African cities and closely examine the novel forms of labor and sociality that emerge in response to energy shortage. The figure of the petroleum smuggler is depicted in a number of these recent films. He appears as what we might think of as a kind of fuel transport apparatus who takes advantage of breakdown to participate in the prevailing modes of accumulation dominant in African frontier zones. The smuggler's work brings him in contact with the materiality and toxicity of petroleum and produces a dangerous type of human, non-human interconnectedness experienced by those who are excluded from networks that transport oil around the globe. Petro-noir films, I argue, stress the dark dimensions of human proximity to vital matter, and it is sometimes I argue those dark dimensions are occluded by those who sort of celebrate without qualification human matter intermingling. In the fourth chapter, I go to Ghana, where I have spent a lot of time looking at the kinds of cultural productions that materialize around energy and technological infrastructures, in this case, electricity and the internet in northern Ghana. The broadening network of electricity around Tamale in northern Ghana, and you can see that the map is trying to demonstrate the extent of that electrification network in the northern regions of Ghana. So the broadening of that electricity network, coupled with the slow expansion of telecommunication and media infrastructures, have created conditions that support a small, informal straight-to-video distribution circuit, which I found absolutely fascinating. With limited competition from television and YouTube, Dagbani language movie makers, so Dagbani being one of the languages spoken in and around Tamale, unlike their counterparts making movies in English in Accra and Lagos, continue to make and circulate their movies for consumers throughout the northern region in this material format. So whereas people in Accra, for the most part, are accessing content on their phones or via their laptops, and it's very rare to be able these days. I was just in Ghana a year ago to find content distributed on VCDs or CDs any longer. Pretty easy if you have access to the internet or can afford it, or you have a good phone plan, to find content. But in the North, it's still those DVDs, VCDs, and pen drives that people are using to circulate their movies. So there's been this kind of pocket created by the availability of electricity, but the still very limited access to internet there. In this chapter, I discuss a selection of Dagbani movies produced by OBL Studios in Tamale. In particular, um, a 1 hour film that he produced called Paele, The Rise of Montana in 2017. A film that depends on electricity for its production and the computer generated and enhanced sounds, movement, and images that make tangible the key elements of Dagbon origin narratives and drum histories. And on the left side of the screen, you see a still from Paele. Um, I try to think about the way these energetic elements, these special effects, are used to make the mythic real to the senses and alive to the present. And then finally, chapter 5, Visual Arts of Energy Ruins, compares the ecological politics enacted by a documentary and a series of art installations about energy waste, plastic waste, and electronic waste in Ghana. The documentary is called Welcome to Sodom. It's set in an electronic waste dump in Accra, the same one that Kajitan Iheka talks about in his book that I alluded to today a little bit earlier. And the art installations of two Ghanaian artists, Serge Atukwe Clote, whose work you see pictured here, and Patrick Turkson. And I, through these forms, explore energy consumption, I argue that these artists are attempting to explore energy consumption through their close attention to the waste generated from energy's commodity forms, from its byproducts, politics, regimes of labor, and social life. Taking on plastic waste as their material and theme, these artworks deal with human and non-human relationships in the age of climate catastrophe more explicitly than the African films analyzed in earlier sections of the book. As presented in the documentary and the installations, waste commands attention in its liveliness and vibrancy and raises crucial questions about plasticity as a condition of life in the global South. The reach of plastic waste, its pervasiveness and persistence is planetary in scale. However, the expressive forms discussed here reflect on the deeply historical patterns through which energy waste circulates and accumulates. And that's important. I began by quoting from Morton, but what I suggest here is this art offers not only an artistic intervention, but a theoretical intervention too, because it allows us to think critically about people like Morton, who tend to generalize very broadly about the human without accounting for the deeply historical patterns, as I said, through which energy and energy waste circulates and accumulates, right? So Morton, without recognizing or saying, to my mind, enough about slavery, colonialism, and the neo-colonial extractive processes that are thriving in the current moment. So if we read these artists as theorists, they have something really important to contribute to conversations about energy. Clote's Afro-Gallenism, the creation of art with recycled jerry cans, and I hope you can get a sense of that through this image here. And Turkson's repurposed sculptures. His work is made from repurposed flip-flops and other kinds of plastic shoes that he collects on the beach. They wash in from the ocean. Both of these, I argue, invite people to feel part of plasticity in its vastness across time and space and in its intimate and ordinary relations with human bodies. Let me conclude by just saying that most generally, African energy world, I hope, demonstrates the critical role of humanities-based research by showing the extent to which human modern life is enmeshed with energy and calling out the enduring legacies of racism and colonialism that unevenly distribute the benefits of energy and modernity, as well as the benefit or the risks of energy-related violence. The book stands beside novelist Amitav Ghosh, who states that, quote, the worldwide adoption of colonial methods of extraction and consumption is responsible for the great acceleration of carbon emissions into the atmosphere and for the cascade of devastating effects now upon us. Just as crucially, I argue, energy humanities helps us to imagine and theorize what Ghosh calls a vitalist politics. A vitalist politics that might dismantle the old mechanistic ideologies of conquest that undergird modernity, so that we might build ways of living that recognize the deep interconnectedness of all life and matter on our planet without, however, and crucially, disregarding the enduring legacies of human histories of unfreedom and exploitation. Thank you. I went a little longer than I wanted to, so please do share your comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carmela. Um, I'm wondering if we should go straight to questions now. I have some of my own, but I noticed that there is also a delay in, the streaming. So I think I'd like to wait a few minutes just to make sure, or seconds, to make sure that the audience also comes to the end of your presentation before going on with the Q&A or beginning the Q&A, if that's okay.
That's great.
Simon, are you okay with that approach?
Go ahead and ask a question of your own.
I can go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. In that case, I will go. I have a few questions. This is all very interesting, but I will start with a question from the end of your presentation where you mentioned Serge Atukwe-Clote. And I first came across his work quite suddenly last summer in Barcelona, where his work or one of his pieces was hanging over a facade at a museum in Barcelona. So my question is this: how is he and other artists like him, such as Turkson? I believe you mentioned Turkson as well. How are these artists who deal with uh, eco issues, no? How are they being received in Ghana or in Africa more generally?
Thank you. Thank you for that very important question. So both of these artists are based in Ghana. Serge lives in Accra. He has a studio there that I was able to visit on numerous occasions. And he had, Ella Nancy's work, I mean, you can probably see that he is kind of alluding to the work of Ella Nancy, who works with tapestries woven from, well, it used to be bottle caps, but pieces of metal. So like Anansi Clote has a studio where he apprentices young artists. He pays them a decent wage to work with him in the creation of these installations. They also work together in collecting the jerry cans that they then turn into art. And he's very committed to involving the community in the production the creation of the art, the display of the art, the making of the art, the collection of the refuse that becomes the art. So, in Accra, for example, he hangs tapestries in his neighborhood, inviting people to walk among them, to feel them, to be sort of part of the atmosphere that they create. Um, his art, I think people respond very, very positively. Uh, both in terms of the fact that it's there, right? It begins in Ghana and circulates in Ghana, not exclusively across a kind of elite global North
Right.
museum network. But and also, of course, is made in Ghana. And I think it's remarkable that Cloté is also trying to create an art infrastructure there by training young people to do the kind of work that he does. And he gives them a lot of freedom to arrange the plastic the way that they'd like, to create their own style of knot with the copper wiring that he uses. Um, Patrick is in the western region of Ghana. His art too. He trained at the Art Institute in Kumasi,
Mm.
so he teaches there and trains young artists there. His work has displayed all over Ghana, various parts of Africa, and all over the world. He doesn't have a studio setup. He works alone, collects the flip-flops from the beaches on his own, sort of a more quiet meditative practice. But that art too has been very, very well received. Um, uh, and again, he is someone committed to making art, sharing art, teaching artists in Ghana to address the kind of uneven distribution of or uneven availability of opportunity that still exists between the global north and the global south.
Thank you very much. There are a few questions in the chat, so I'll go to them right away. Moradawun asked that for your third chapter, when you mentioned Fat Kine, is it to contrast um, with other films, or to present Fat Kine as an example of the Petro Noir? Um, she says she sees Petro Noir. She sees the Petro Noir dimension, but not the noir in the director's work.
Yeah, thank you, Mordewu, and thanks for being here too. No, Fatkine is for comparison. So except for Fatkine, it's the other films that represent this genre called Petro Noir. Fatkine is very interesting in that it presents such an optimistic energy landscape, right? And that in Fatkine, it's really, you're right, Kine's oil wealth that makes possible her feminism, her autonomy, her independence. And it's interesting that that is oil wealth derived from transnational corporation and not linked directly to the state. And it is a Dakar where, for the most part, things work. Traffic flows, people park in an orderly fashion, um, and people seem to have access to gasoline. It's also a film where the safety precautions around petroleum work well. Think about that instance where we see Fatkine donning her white lab coat, right, testing the fuel with a beaker. So that provides an interesting contrast, um, to my mind, to the petro noir films that come more than 10 years later.
Okay, and there's another question here. Well, it starts with congratulations to you
Oh,
on the
thank you.
new books. It's very exciting. And I wonders if you could say a bit more about which film or films by Sissoko you engage and how you're reading his work.
Sure. So, Bamako, I address in the chapter on debt, and of course, it's the film that is most obviously right about debt there. But what I try to do in that instance is draw out the theme of energy in that film that's really, focused on putting the World Bank on trial, as well as I try to thicken um, what has already sort of been written about his use of realism, thinking about ethical realism, and the way that his real, that the way that his work muddies the border between the actual and the cinematic. I also, in the conclusion, talk about waiting for happiness and the figure of Mata, right, who is the electrician who seems to be increasingly frustrated by his inability to make electricity available to um, Abdullah's Abdullah's mother, and talk about in that instance how electricity, this sort of mystic or mysterious, invisible form of energy, eludes his control. But also, I try to draw attention to the way, again, the film plays with wind. Although, again, it's not about using wind as a source of energy, there is a lot of attention given to wind as part of the ecology of the film. Think about the first scene where we hear the sound of wind brushing against the microphone. We watch as wind again gets in the way of human agency. So think about wind prevents the taxi cab from starting because it's somehow messed up the carburetor. Wind buries the radio. So despite best efforts to put that radio in a secure place where you'll be able to find it again, when interferes with human intentions there. And then think too about wind bringing the body to shore, the body of Michael who dies when he's trying to um, migrate to Europe. Wind also, bringing the light bulb to shore again and again and again, despite the fact that it has been thrown to sea after Mata's death. So those are some of the issues that I try to draw out there.
Thank you very much. There's a question about energy in Nigeria. It says, can you perhaps comment on the Nigerian liquid natural gas corporate sponsorship of the Nigeria Prize? Is that an instance of greenwashing? And how do efforts like that articulate with the kind of reparation you refer to in the documentary about Chad Cameroon about the Chad Cameroon pipeline?
So I don't know a whole lot about the effort that you are alluding to. And I suppose that but I know enough to just comment very generally, perhaps, and I apologize that if I don't answer your question in a satisfactory manner. Um, I mean, on the one hand, there is a way in which, of course, we could read that as greenwashing. I'd have to know more about that specific instance. Um, I think what the greenwashing sometimes can contribute to an erasure of complexity and nuance that the films for sure want us to begin to pay attention to. I mean, there's not one of us that is outside of energy and somehow implicated, I think, in all of the disparities that I alluded to at the beginning. Now, that's not to say that we are all implicated equally, and for sure, there's a lot to say about Nigeria, the Nigerian elite, transnational oil companies, and all of that. Um, I don't know that, however, that delegitimizes the prize or means that the efforts to promote Nigerian literature or African literature um, are not somehow not important. So I'm hedging. Um, I understand what you're trying to say, and absolutely, I think it would be important for us to recognize that and how it might be interpreted as a form of green washing. But I wouldn't just want to leave it at that. How does that figure into reparations? I mean, I suppose one could argue that sponsoring a prize could be understand as a form of reparation, but that I think that wouldn't go far enough. Of course, when I think about the availability of global modernity made possible by energy, and in certain African settings, I would think about things like major infrastructure projects that provide roads and clean water and access to people who don't have that. We'd also want to be alert to the fact that efforts like sponsoring a literary prize can very easily eclipse the slow violence that people living in extractive regions are forced to live with, the toxicity, as I said, that their bodies are forced to absorb. So, I mean, perhaps the best way to think about it is to, if we're writing about and teaching works that have been recognized by that prize, is to bringing that prize itself into our discussion and thinking through all of um, uh, the politics that your question raises, as well as some of the complexities that um, might not be immediately apparent. It's a great insight. Thank you for that.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. And Moradun comments on the irony of Sembene having made an optimistic film about petroleum. Do you have any thoughts on that too?
I do. I don't want to be hard on Simba. It's hard to do easy, but it is ironic. But it's an outlier, right? Our Africanist, Marxist, socialist Semben. This is an outlier. I do talk about the fact that um, it does seem there's also a kind of neoliberal, Africanist, feminist discourse articulated there. So it's not just that Kine's feminism is imbricated with the economic autonomy she has a result of the fact that she manages this petrol station, but even the kind of think about the advice that she gives to the man with the wheelchair, right? That he needs to take her gift and he needs to make it useful. The fact that there's a scene in which she encounters a man on a bicycle who is a man with a disability, and she tries to give him some money, and he tells her that he gives her his business card and says, "No, I don't want charity. I work for a living." So it is kind of problematic, but interesting in that there is this sort of, entrepreneurial, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, make the best of it, that seems kind of unlike some of Semben's other films.
Mhm. Mhm. And thank you so much. Another question, this is about development and underdevelopment from Anne Carlson, who wonders if you could no, asked how you theorize the concepts of development and underdevelopment in your book.
Hi, Anne. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the question. So of course, I go back to Walter Rodney with underdevelopment, but using people too, like Catherine Youssef, who think about underdevelopment as a condition that is continually perpetuated. So it's not undeveloped, but that actively the active underdevelopment of certain regions of the world subsidizes the development of other regions of the world, which is particularly acute situation when we think about energy. With Catherine Youssef, what I tried to do though is sort of extend the historical trajectory of her work. She's thinking about slavery and colonialism, of course, very, very important. But I'm also trying to think about neo-colonial extractive political economy in relation to the perpetuation of that underdevelopment. I also rely on the anthropologists who work in Africa these days, who I think are doing some of the most exciting theorizing and the theorizing that sort of begins with things on the ground. So Lade Adunbe's work in the Delta has been part of my thinking about underdevelopment. Kristen Phillips, who works on energy in Tanzania, remote Tanzania, very different energy context than what I described in Ghana, very different than Nigeria. I use her to think through energy underdevelopment, as well as the anthropologist Michael Degani, who talks about the electricity grid in Tanzania. So um, a lot of folks doing interesting work around underdevelopment and energy that allows us to still cite our Rodney, which I think is very important in this day and especially right now, but extend sort of the reach of that foundational work.
Mm-hmm. And with this response, I think you're commenting also to some extent of the next question, or which is actually a comment that says, please consider the escalation of neo-colonialist extraction from African soil and the human capital being exploited.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I'm sorry that if I didn't describe it well. Absolutely. Neo-colonial extraction happening, and not just around energy, but now, of course, around
Mm-hmm.
critical minerals and the human lives that are African human lives that are both involved in the labor of that extraction, but also are involved in the extraction in as much as they live with the slow violence produced by that extraction, which of course does link back to underdevelopment, where we see there's kind of these very small enclaves of prosperity around extractive industries, and there isn't a lot of outward trickle that emerges from that. Thank you. Thank you for that point.
Okay. Um, I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I will add one of my own. I am wondering about your research in Tamale on the production and distribution of commercial films in that region. And I'm wondering how the sporadic and uneven access to energy shapes the identity of the filmmakers that are producing these films.
Right. So that's a good point. So Ghana has been quite successful in extending the national grid. However, that does not certainly mean that everybody has access to energy or reliable access to energy. Nonetheless, it's quite remarkable how in even some of these very remote villages, you see folks have an electrical connection and a satellite dish that gives them access to electricity, at least periodically. Um, OBL, the filmmaker that I've worked most closely with in Tamale, is certainly able to make the quality of films that he makes because he is able to have reliable access to energy, but also the internet. So OBL is absolutely, maybe he's tuned in, I hope so, remarkable in that he works full time as a nurse educator. So he has a master's degree. He works full time as a professor, and also on the side has this studio where he, like Clote, takes in young filmmakers and visual effects artists and trains them in the production of visual effects and films. That full-time job, however, allows him, it makes him quote unquote privileged in a certain way. It allows him to be able to afford um, a monthly energy bill, right? To have a generator that he can rely on if power goes out, but also he has um, access to the internet, so he is able to afford an internet plan and a very expensive internet router that gives him high speed access. It's that access that has also enabled him to learn how to be a visual effects specialist. He's completely self-trained. It's absolutely astounding to me. And I've worked in Ghana with self-trained people for a long, long time, but he's maybe the first to achieve such a high quality of expertise. And he's done this by downloading or paying to participate in visual effects workshops. So learning with people from all over the world and then getting access to the software and the computers and practicing and then sharing what he knows with others. So his situation in some sense is unusual, and it does help us understand the high production quality. And he's been very, very successful also selling films locally. He's very highly regarded in Ghana.
Mhm. Thank you very much. I'm checking my chat. Okay. We don't have any more questions. Thank you so much, Carmela, for your
Oh, thank you. This
generous
was so
presentation
fun.
and engagement with us this afternoon. And on behalf of everybody, I'd like to wish you all the very best in your new project, which is on the history of plastics in Accra. No, sorry, not in Accra, in Ghana.
Yes, yes,
And
exactly.
I hope we have you back again to talk to us about that in the future. I'll hand over to Simon.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, and thank you and congratulations, Carmela. I
Thank
hope
you.
everybody who's watching here is making sure you either get a copy of her book for yourself or at least for your library. It's Indiana University Press, yes?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so go to Indiana University Press and make sure you all get a copy of this
Well,
book.
thank you.
That was a fabulous talk and a really, really wonderful, interesting Q&A at the end of it all. So I hope people, again, also if you want to carry on the conversation, keep the conversation going through the ALA Facebook page, that would be fine. And so this is the swan song for this year's series. It's been fabulous. It's been a fabulous talk today, fabulous series all the way through. If you have any suggestions for us for lectures for next year, if you've got a book coming out, if you know somebody who has a book coming out that will need drawing attention to, please let us know so we can set up next year's lecture series and make it just as successful as this one. And I'm also going to draw attention to 2 additional deadlines that are coming up soon. If you are coming to Nairobi for the 50th annual conference of the African Literature Association, the deadline for registration for that is coming up very, very shortly. And then on a slightly less positive note, we are in a little bit of a crisis in relation to not having anybody yet as a nomination for the vice president of the ALA. And the call went out last week for reopening the nominations for that particular position. The nominations close at the end of Wednesday, that is April the 30th. Please, if you have somebody that you think could do the job of being ALA vice president, which then rolls over to being the president automatically the following year, please do send me a nomination as soon as possible, but by the end of the day on Wednesday, April the 30th. But again, congratulations to Carmela on her new book, and thank you again to Carmela and to Dorothy for running things for today, and obviously to Lexi for keeping things running in the background. But for now, over and out from this year's ALA lecture series.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.